Hi everyone. So we're going to start off looking at biological explanations of gambling behavior. First of all, you need to know how somebody can actually be diagnosed with pathological gambling. So starting off from the DSM, as you all know, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual states that, it actually looks at three main criteria in terms of diagnosing somebody with pathological gambling, which you do need to know. So the first one is when a person feels that they're losing control of their gambling behavior, so they actually cannot stop doing it. They also cannot stop thinking about the gambling behavior, for example. So they might be sitting at home and all they can think about is playing a lotto or, for example, going to the slot machines. And finally, they continue to gamble even though there are issues. For example, you've just spent all your life savings in the betting shop. You have no more money, but yet you still do it. Or, for example, your whole family have left you and you keep gambling, so you don't want to stop. Okay, so this is the three main criteria that the DSM uses to diagnose somebody with pathological gambling addiction. So as you know, this section is split into initiation, so how, for example, gambling starts, why people maintain their gambling behavior, and why it's difficult for them to stop it and they keep relapsing. That means they keep going back to the same gambling behavior. So for initiation, looking at the biological explanation, it's all to do with our genetics, what we inherit, for example, what we actually inherit from our parents, and etc. So what psychologists have done, so Shara et al. In 2005, they have found that um, men, for example, twin men, there have been genetic transmission link between the two of them. So that means, for example, if one of the male twins have a gambling addiction, the other one actually does as well. Black et al. Also in 2006, they found that first degree relatives of gamblers were more likely to suffer from gambling, pathological gambling especially. Okay, and this was more likely than distant relatives. So, for example, your brother and you have a brother and your brother's a gambler, and you being his sister or his brother, you're more likely to also um, suffer from the pathological gambling behavior rather than, I don't know, your second cousin or your third cousin, etc. In terms of maintenance, this is actually quite interesting because it can be broken down into two different reasons why gamblers maintain their behavior. So the first one, the pituitary adrenal response, and this is a bit like, maybe you remember this from AS, a bit like the fight or flight response or so when we looked at stress. This pituitary adrenal response signifies the whole chronic stress. So, as you remember from stress for AS, you'd find out that the adrenal cortex releases cortisol. So, just say, for example, these are actually cortisol, and cortisol is our stress hormone. So, for example, when we are under chronic stress and we continuously see certain things that should cause us our body make our body become quite intense, etc., we release cortisol. And one way that they detect how much cortisol we have in our system is through our saliva. So this is what Paris et al. In 2010 found. They found that pathological gamblers, for example, when they're exposed to videos of gambling behavior of their choice. Just say, for example, it was the national lottery or slot machines or racing. So whichever one that they like to get into, and they were also given a neutral video as well. Say, for example, a roller coaster ride. They found that they didn't have. In fact, they had hardly any cortisol in their salivary glands compared to people who were not seen as pathological gamblers. They had a lot more of this cortisol in their system, which shows that pathological gamblers, they do not see their gambling, or they have a very desensitized view on stressful stimuli. Yeah, so then it doesn't phase them for roller coasters, national lottery, horse race. None of these things phase them, which which signifies now that they're most likely to continue their behavior because they don't get stressed by it, for example, because obviously they have none of the stress hormones in their system. Okay, so that's one explanation, the pituitary adrenal response. Another explanation in terms of why gamblers maintain their addictive behavior is through sensation seeking, and it's Zuckerman 1979 in a nutshell just said basically that these pathological gamblers um, have a more a personality where they have to have a lot more thrills. So, for example, bungee jumping and all the thrill type of activities, they have a greater sense of having to do these kind of stuff. Whereas people who are low sensation seekers, they don't tend to be pathological gamblers because they don't tend to have this type of predisposition to high sensation seeking type of behavior. So they link that as well to why gamblers maintain their behavior continuously. And it's almost weird actually when you see people continuously going to the betting shop, for example. It's almost like they're quite thrilled. It's almost like they're quite excited by the thought of going in there, not anticipating what's going to happen, if they're going to win, if they're going to lose, etc. So it's all that type of sensation seeking. We're always, and you may have met somebody, for example, who's always looking to do something new. So novel experiences. So this is what these are two different reasons that they give for why gamblers maintain their particular behavior, so biological reasons. And obviously, when it comes to relapse, gamblers have issues because what this explanation says, the reason why gamblers always tend to relapse is simply because they're trying to avoid being bored. Probably because they're quite high sensation seekers in the first place. They don't like feelings of not doing anything much or not stimulating themselves in any way, for example. So they gamble to avoid being bored. And Blaskinsky et al. In 1990, they found this that pathological gamblers scored higher on a boredom scale than non-pathological um, gamblers. So in terms of they're the ones that are looking to do things which to escape their particular boredom. So in terms of evaluating the biological explanations of gambling, remember we are only evaluating the biological explanation approach rather than actual studies, individual studies that we've actually used. So some nice ones that I like to use. So reductionism. So it's reducing gambling behavior to 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 genetics, for example. Yeah. So it's not taking into account that there could be other factors which may actually contribute to somebody's gambling behavior. So, for example, rather it just be genetic, it could be, for example, you live in a household where everybody gambles in your household, whether they're family or not. So it could be more of a social thing, or it could be more of a self-esteem thing, or it could be more of a financial thing. Yes, sometimes people gamble because, playing the lottery, they just naturally want to win a lot more money. So it could be all these other reasons. So the fact that the biological explanation fails to actually take into account these other reasons says that the approach in itself is actually can be quite reductionist. Okay, so that's actually what a little minus there. That means negative. The diathesis stress model is a positive because it's basically saying that yes, biological factors are important, but it's also saying that environmental factors are also important. So we may be born with a predisposition to become a gambler, but it doesn't mean it's going to pop up. It only pops up if, for example, our environment, something in our environment means that we're going to start initiating that behavior, which now starts tangling with our genetics, etc. So it just starts popping up. So, for example, why this is a good thing is because it's showing that both biological and environmental factors can actually interplay within each other. And then finally, this would be, for example, a negative, which the approach actually doesn't take into account. So why are some types of gambling more addictive than others, for example? So Breen and Zinnemann found that more online gambling is more addictive than other types of gambling. So it doesn't actually explain that. So these are the main issues with this particular approach to explaining gambling behavior. So in terms of biological explanations of smoking behavior, again, when it talks about initiation, it talks, just like gambling, it deals with the whole genetics of why people smoke excessively or why people are pathological smokers. So genetics, general research has basically found a between a 39 to 80% heritability factor rate in terms of smoking for smokers. And obviously these studies, so Vincatel 2005, he conducted a Dutch study, and basically they what they done is they looked at 1,572 twins, okay, and what they found that there was a 46% um, um, rate in terms of taking up smoking. So they found it was down to genetic, compared to a 56%, which is where they found it was more to do with the environment. I would say, for example, that hold on, environmental says a whole lot more than genetic. However, we'll talk about that afterwards. Okay, so at the moment, 46% genetic was what Vincatel 2005 found, and Boardman in the USA in 2008 found that when they looked at 348 monozygotic, that is identical twins, versus 321 dizygotic twins, that is non-identical twins, they found that them taking up smoking was down to genetics. Of 42% took up smoking was due to the genetic predisposition. Okay, maintenance behavior. Um, so why smokers continue their particular behavior. So Vincatel 2005 came up with the nicotine dependence theory, which found that because of our genetic, well not our, because of the genetic disposition between smokers, for example, what happens is that when they do get nicotine, so you should know what this is. So these are neurons we have, got millions of them, but what happens is once a smoker who is genetically predisposed to becoming addicted to cigarettes, when they get nicotine in their system, so we have these particular receptors in our brains, for example, which pick up nicotine. So these receptors are like, oh, hello, nicotine, for example. And what happens is, what the effects of nicotine is, it actually why does it keep going? It actually stimulates the release of dopamine. Okay, so dopamine is a key player in feelings of pleasure, feelings of reward, feelings of feeling nice about yourself, etc. So what happens is dopamine gets released in the synaptic cleft here, and we have a lot more dopamine, a lot more feeling of pleasure in our system once we have that nicotine in our system. And so what happens is, because we have all this dopamine, all these feelings of niceness, yeah, it stimulates our pleasure circuits, etc. in our system. Our brain adapts a bit. Our brain is like, oh, we like all this dopamine in our system, etc. But when we stop nicotine, we stop smoking, what happens is our brain misses it. Our brain is like, we've adapted to all this dopamine. We want more dopamine. So what happens is that person starts feeling withdrawal symptoms. They start. That's why we get That's why people who smoke get cravings. They feel like, because their brain basically wants more of that feeling of that heightened dopamine in their system. So what happens is, because of those withdrawal symptoms, that person now picks up another cigarette and starts smoking. Hence why we start having serial or pathological smokers smoking all the time, yeah, 20, 30 a day, etc. Yeah, and the problem is, it can also explain why some people, for example, when they pick up a cigarette to smoke it, they'll be like, oh, this is disgusting, I ain't gonna do this no more. Or, oh, okay, this is smoking, but they don't get addicted to it. Where some people, all it takes is just one, and they become so addicted to it, just because of this genetic predisposition some people actually do have. Okay, and what Vincatel found is that there's a 75% genetic factor or genetic reason why these in terms of nicotine dependency. So 75% can be accounted for why people are so dependent on nicotine, because of this reason. But basically, we are already predisposed to becoming addicted, and when we do finally get that nicotine, etc., we find it very, very difficult to stop. Okay. Another explanation for maintenance is also prenatal exposure. So obviously, when mothers who smoke when they're pregnant. So Booker et al. Found that mothers who smoke 20 plus cigarettes per day, they tend to have children who, as adults, will most likely become addicted to cigarette smoke. Okay, so that explains maintenance in terms of the biological explanations. And finally, relapse. Again, very, very straightforward. Because of our genetic predisposition, or some people have a genetic predisposition, it's very difficult to actually stop and then continue to stop. And what happens? People who have this disposition, they're most likely to relapse and start doing it again. And Zain et al., or Zian et al., 2003, found that 54% was due, in terms of relapse, was due to our heritability, in terms of our genetics. So these people most likely to risk, in terms of risk for quit failure, these people who were predisposed to addiction were 54% most likely to just fail once they try not to do it. Okay, so this is the biological explanation of smoking and gambling in a nutshell. Please go back and do listen to it some more. In terms of the evaluation for smoking, again, I've kept it the same reductionism. Yes, we may have a predisposition to becoming addicted to keep smoking cigarettes, etc. However, we cannot take out the fact that it could be, for example, peer pressure. It could be the fact that we've observed a particular model or celebrity, or somebody who we look up to, whoever, to smoke continuously every day. So we've picked up the behavior from there. So we can't just solely say it's because of a biological explanation. Okay. The good thing about, however, so that's a negative. The good thing about using the biological explanation for smoking is that because we know that certain genes may be accountable for, in terms of our vulnerability to smoking, what they've now done, which is a real life application, is they have genomic medicine. So this is terms of, they look for specific medicine specifically for people who have this genetic vulnerability, and they gear it to help them overcome it. So not just having patches, they have medicines which, for example, work on particular variations of genes, etc. So these people may have a variant of a particular type of gene, and what this medicine does is it accounts for this to help them overcome their addiction. So it has a good, in terms of treatment, it has a very, very good real life application here. So this is just an example question. This question was asked in January 2012, and it hasn't been asked since. So it could be biological approach explaining smoking behavior could be asked again. So it could be asked about smoking behavior or gambling behavior. And what I've done here is just an example answer with a key. And what I've done, I tried to highlight key things that I was doing, for example, because obviously, as we know, 4 marks plus 4 marks equals 4 marks goes towards our outline, and 4 marks goes towards our evaluation. And what I find is that evaluation is very, very poor with people, because they tend to just use bits that they've remembered from the textbook without actually really using it, if you understand what I'm saying. So in terms of the commentary and effective commentary, etc. So if I just read it for you now, and explain to you where I would have got the marks, for example, and why. Okay, so the biological approach states that the initiation of smoking is due to our genetics. So straight away, clear point you're making. You're not waffling. You're not saying once upon a time there was a biological approach, which said, you are getting straight down there. Okay, so genetics. So individuals may inherit genes that predispose them to be more likely to take up smoking behavior. So you're elaborating. You're giving them a bit more detail about genetics. You're not just saying it's just genetics. You are going a bit further. Okay. The biological approach explains maintenance behavior because of the increased presence of nicotine. Okay, so now we've moved on from the initiation because of genetics to why this behavior is maintained. So that's a clear point: increased presence of nicotine, and it stimulates an nicotinic acetylcholine, I never know how to say this, sorry guys, receptors, which then increases the amount of neurotransmitter dopamine in our system. Okay. Again, some more elaboration. Dopamine is linked to feelings of pleasure, when the levels of nicotine decreases because the individual stops smoking, dopamine then decreases and the individual no longer feels pleasure anymore and leads to withdrawal symptoms. So that's nice elaboration here. This is because of the changes in the brain due to a combination of more dopamine. The brain wants that heightened level of dopamine again and will give signals or cravings. This then means that the individual will smoke another cigarette to overcome the withdrawal symptoms. Okay. Maintenance behavior in smoking has also been linked to prenatal exposure to nicotine. Again, another clear point. And Booker et al. 2003 found that women who smoked more than 20 cigarettes per day were more likely to have children addicted to nicotine as adults. Again, you are elaborating, I didn't highlight that, but you are elaborating in more detail. And because of genetic predisposition, again, it's another clear point, quitting smoking, here we're talking about relapse, will also be an issue and therefore will be most likely to relapse and start smoking again. Okay, so this is a nice clear points that you've made for your AO1. You've elaborated those for your AO1, etc. You've given different reasons and you've spoken about the biological approach as a whole. Okay. When it comes to our AO2/AO3, don't be fooled to think that you have to put everything that you know under the sun. So you have to put about reductionism, you have to put about that. You do not have to do this. It's not about the quantity you use, about the quality of how you use the information. So there's different ways that you can actually evaluate. So for example, I have decided to evaluate using studies, but I'm not just using studies, I'm now commenting on these studies. What do they mean? Yeah, so this is where I'm going to get my effective stuff. So research has supported, again, use keywords like supported, suggest, etc. This is what I call a clear AO2/3 link word. Okay, it supported a biological influence to smoking behavior. Okay, Fink et al. 2005 found in their study, so all this thing I'm doing here, from here to here, okay, it's all the stuff that anyone can pick up from a textbook. Okay, it's what they found, how it's supported, etc. So this is just me summarizing all the textbook information. It's not really going to get me much AO2 marks at all. Yeah, it's going to probably get me into the rudimentary or basic level. Okay, so what I do after that really counts. So what I've said here, I call these commentary. They want you to comment on whatever you have started off in terms of your evaluation. So this could have been a reductionism point, or it could have been a treatment point. It doesn't matter. Okay, so these studies suggest that genes do have a large influence on smoking behavior and implies that if we are aware of this genetic risk from childhood, measures can be implemented to ensure people know they have an increased risk of being a smoking addict. The issue, however, so this is now commentary or commenting on what the studies have actually told you. See, this requires a bit of thinking here, and this is what separates the B's from the A grades here. Okay. The issue, however, is that initiation due to heritability show less than 50%. Yeah, as we see in these studies, so the 42% and the 46%, which then suggests that environmental factors are more important than genetic factors. However, once an individual with a genetic vulnerability does start, they'll find it difficult to stop, which is highlighted in the Vink et al. 2005 studies at 75%. Okay, so you're using the studies here. The diathesis stress model states that even if an individual is predisposed to disease or addiction, it does not mean it will show up unless environmental conditions interact with the vulnerability. For example, a genetic disposition to smoking addiction and breaking up with a long-term partner, that is stress, which may encourage the smoking behavior, and finally, nicotine dependency. Okay, so this is me now commenting on these studies that we can just get from any textbook or whatever, etc. Yeah, so we've done something with it. So this will put me onto the reasonably effective type of thing. Yeah, so what I've done here, I'm now going to finalize it to make it really effective. So this now implies that as well as encouraging the release of this genetic knowledge earlier on in an individual's life, appropriate coping strategies for dilemmas that they could face during life should be actively encouraged to prevent them even taking up smoking in the first place. So I've now evaluated this whole particular theory. I've looked at the studies and I've looked at how we can actually evaluate it based on if it's purely to do with genetics, basically. Okay, and what we can do with it. So I've gone through that route. There are many different routes that we can actually do. Okay, but I've decided to do this route. So if you can see how we've commented and we've even further commented on what we've commented on in the first place. Okay, so remember, whatever we put up here, so it could be a reductionist argument, it could be the approach could be criticized because it's said to be based on a reductionist argument, and so on, yeah, and explain why, and then you comment on that, etc. Yeah, so that is how we do in for your AO2, AO3 commentary. So here would be enough to get you between 3 to 4 marks here, and this will definitely get you the 4 marks here because they're looking for specifically commentary.